Folks, since 1979, county highway departments across South Dakota have installed signs along the roadside where fatal car accidents have occurred. They call them fatal accident markers, and on the signs, in big letters, is the word think. You see, the program originated, it was an effort to make motorists more aware of how dangerous it is, obviously, to drink and drive. And nearly half of all these markers on South Dakota roadsides are because of alcohol-related accidents. But today, these memorials also remember those lost due to not wearing seatbelts, distracted driving, speeding. You see, the purpose of these signs is clear and it is effective. A life lost in a motor vehicle crash is never forgotten. It's a reminder to drive safely, arrive alive. It's a plea, let's not let history repeat itself. Well, today we're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 1. And here Paul he's concluding an argument he began in chapter 8. The problem he's addressing in chapter 8 was the relationship Christians should have with pagan temples that were simply everywhere, and those temples permeated the Roman culture. Paul's concern, as we've identified the past couple of days, is that these strong Roman Christians in Corinth who insist on their rights and freedoms and now have experienced the freedom of the Christian life free from all the 613 Jewish rules, that by living a life without any boundaries, without any constraint, without any self-regulation, Paul's concern is that they are unknowingly going to find themselves drawn back into paganism. In a sense, Paul's worry is that history is going to repeat itself. Let me explain. In the beginning verses of chapter 10, he reminds them, the Corinthians, of their ancestors, the Israelites, who lived as slaves in Egypt. Paul reminds them of how God orchestrated their exodus from Egypt. And as Paul recalls the history here of their exodus from Egypt, no early Christian would have had much trouble decoding what Paul was saying. They all immediately saw parallels between their journey in Corinth and what their ancestors experienced way back in Egypt. Ages ago, God had led the Israelites out of slavery through the desert toward the promised land. And yet, throughout their wilderness journey, the Israelites, they struggled. They struggled with things like idolatry, sexual immorality. They'd go after other gods and stage contests of strength between those other gods and Yahweh, their God. They'd grumble, wishing they'd never left Egypt in the first place. Paul's point here would have been absolutely clear to the Corinthians. Just like God embraced the Israelites and led them out of slavery, the Corinthians, don't miss this, they were being led away from paganism by being embraced by God's love. But by clinging to their idealized version of freedom without restraint, they were metaphorically speaking, they were being drawn back to Egypt, back to the paganism of their past, and away from the good life that God wanted for them. In verse 23, Paul says, "All things are lawful," a phrase the Romans everywhere repeated incessantly. But Paul goes on, "All things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. All things are lawful, but not all things build up." You can do anything and everything. You are right. But the good life God wants for you is found when, rather than seeking your own gain as the pagans do, you first seek gain for those around you. Don't let history repeat itself, Paul is saying. In verse 31, Paul sums up his argument that he began way back in chapter 8. Whatever you do, do it for the glory of God. How do we do that? Whoever you encounter, Jew, Greek, Christian, do what is best for them. Be imitators of me, Paul says, as I am an imitator of Christ. And in doing so, I promise you this, history won't repeat itself. A couple questions for you today. In your family, where do you see history repeating itself, huh? What ills or struggles of the past have this way of repeating themselves generation to generation? Is it alcoholism? Is it abuse? Is it struggles with mental health? And secondly, what does it take to put an end to these types of systemic generational struggles?